And running. Okay, hopefully the sound works better. We had some trouble with the sound last week, but hopefully this is a little bit clearer. So we are now going to catch up. And this, like I said last week, when I told you we were doing a makeup last week, that allowed us to discuss the topic of Dinah. We're now going to have to jump a parasha. I'm sorry, you can go back to the YouTube archives if you really wanted to check last week's portion for some study with us. And now we're picking back up where the Torah is, because I don't want to stay out of sync. And we're in Miketz. And Miketz is the continuation of the Joseph cycle, right? Last week, Joseph was sold into slavery, went down into the land of Israel. Everyone remembers that basic story, right? In Mrs. Potiphar, got trouble, sent to prison. The beginning of Miketz, he gets out of prison as he interprets Pharaoh's dreams. That means he rises to second in command. He is in charge of handling all the food issues during the years of famine that eventually come, just as he predicted. And that means that his relatives are now showing up before him because they need food, and the land of Canaan doesn't have enough food to support them anymore. So they've come down, the 10 brothers, right? Benjamin was left behind. They come down, and they come before this guy whom they don't recognize, but who recognizes them as his brothers, and we begin the game. We begin the test. And we've talked about that many times in the past. And he sends them off after the first time, having left Simeon behind as sort of collateral. And in the process, he hides their money back in their bags so that by the time they get home, they're like, oh man, right? It looks like we didn't pay. And now how do we go back and get our brother back? They go back, and in fact, they stay at home until they run out of food. And their father's like, all right, you got to go back. And they're like, yeah, but he said we couldn't come back without Benjamin. And he's like, well, don't take Benjamin. They say we have to. Well, don't. We'll have. Of course, Shimon is still down in prison. And it seems like their father is willing to give up Shimon to not give up Benjamin. Eventually, they're going to starve to death. So they convince them. Judah, again, stepping forward, convinces their dad to send Benjamin, and he will guarantee Benjamin's safety. Which brings us to where we are today, which is where they are going to end up having that guarantee put to the test. Everyone caught up?
Yep.
Good. We are on page 268. This is chapter 44 of Bereshit. And this is where it all goes on the line. Page 268. Everyone good? All right, if you wouldn't mind.
Okay. Then he instructed his house steward, this would be Joseph,
yes.
Instructed his house steward as follows. Fill the men's bags with food, as much as they can carry, and put each one's money in the mouth of his bag.
All right, so this is a replay of what happened in the first visit of the brothers. But
put my silver goblet in the mouth of the bag of the youngest one, together with his money for the rations. And he did as Joseph told him.
All right, so now they are planting a special silver cup in Benjamin's bag. All right, this is setting up, they're framing Benjamin essentially. And yeah, now remember when they first appear, when they reappeared before Joseph, when they came back, they confessed about the whole money thing and said, hey, you know, dude, last time we were here, we found the money in our bags, but we don't know what happened. So here, you know, and he's like, no, don't worry about it. So that was to their credit. And now they're being put through that same test with a twist. All right, onward.
With the first light of morning, the men were sent off with their pack animals. They had just left the city and not gone far when Joseph said to his steward, up, go after the men. And when you overtake them, say to them, why did you repay good with evil? It is the very one from which my master drinks and which he uses for divination. It was a wicked thing for you to do.
All right, so it's so cruel because they must have just been getting out of the city, just beginning to think they're in the free and clear, right? It's like, oh, finally, they've gotten rid of that crazy guy who kept yanking our chain and behaving differently. It was just, nah. But we're heading home. We got the food. We've got all our brothers. Phew. And then in the rearview mirror of your camel,
Yeah.
here comes the steward of Joseph, and you got to turn around the caravan and head back into town. And now you're being accused of some horrible theft crime that isn't just theft, but apparently is also mixed up in the spirituality superstitions of Egypt, which you just never want to touch people's holy things because it just always makes people angry.
Okay. Is there a reason with this whole Joseph story we keep seeing people falsely set up and falsely accused, or is that just coincidence?
No, that's not coincidence. It is, you can call it a literary technique. It is also a big issue of how do you know who is and isn't? How do you know who is and isn't guilty? And how do you know what is and isn't honest and all of that? It's also being used as a foil to expose inner character, right? Because the character that comes out when you are put in a situation about which you have no control because you have been framed into this situation is often the truest character that you have. Because what's left, right? It's not something, as we're going to talk about, that you can control by your eloquence of your arguments or the evidence that you can provide. It's just, look, this is just who I am, and I am open and vulnerable during this type of situation. Plus, it's just what happened in the ancient world.
And I think Joseph is really looking to see how these people change.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, for Joseph's trickery in particular, but also with the Judah Tamar and other things as well. But in the Joseph trickery in particular, this is an elaborate ploy, right? They want to see, first of all, whether they will leave Shimon behind. He also wants to see whether they will, once he exposes Benjamin, give up Benjamin, despite what will happen to their father, and despite what will happen to Benjamin. This is very much a perfectly choreographed test to see whether they will treat Benjamin, the new favorite, the way they had treated him when he was the favorite.
And who will step up.
Exactly, right. So, I mean, Joseph has a particular reason, but the broader author also has a reason for using this type of framing, if you will, literary device. Okay, onward.
So the steward overtook them and spoke those words to them. And they said to him, "Why does my lord say such things? Far be it from your servants to do anything of the kind. Here we brought back to you from the land of Canaan the money that we found in the mouths of our bags. How then could we have stolen any silver or gold from your master's house?"
All right, so notice the argument here, right? They're trying to make an argument based on past behavior, which is, look, if we were thieves, do you think we would have returned with the money that you had mistakenly put in our bags, right? We would have said, money? What money? I don't know about no money, and just, been done with it. We have already shown our honesty, and therefore, how can you even suspect us? Of course, what they don't know is that, they've been set up. So,
whichever of your servants it is found with shall die. The rest of us, moreover, shall become slaves to my lord. The steward replied, "Although what you are proposing is right, only the one with whom it is found shall be my slave, but the rest of you shall go free."
Right. Now, what the steward is basically intimating here is that, yes, there was an idea of collective punishment, and that was perfectly normal in Egypt and most of the ancient world. But if it was a collective punishment, it wouldn't serve Joseph's purposes, right? Because Joseph wants to separate the brothers and see how they behave when one of them can take the fall and the others can all go free. And to do that, he has to apparently even subvert the normal Egyptian penalty that would have come for this. He has to slice out Benjamin in order for this to work.
Does the steward know that's what Joseph's plan is?
No, because he has not revealed to them, and apparently not to anyone else around him. You may remember in the original scene where he sees them and he goes and cries in private. He does not want the rest of the Egyptians to know who these people are to him.
Right, so why would the steward not say, "Okay, you got a good idea, you're law stuffer"?
Because he's been given orders.
Oh, he's been given
orders. But he doesn't know why.
So just do Benjamin.
Exactly.
Up to him, the steward.
Oh, well, no, it's not up to him. It's entirely up to Joseph, but he knows what normal practice would be. And when Judah says, "Hey, look, if somebody's guilty of this, you can kill him, because after all, this is more than just theft. This is, some sort of sacrilege by taking this divination cup. And the rest of us are accessories to that, so we would obviously forfeit our freedom. He's probably stating what it was normal ancient Near East practice. And the steward's like, you're right, but that's not what the Joseph guy, who I'm not going to call Joseph because that's not his name for me, that's not what he told me to tell you. What he told me to tell you is that just one of you is going to have to be the slave and only the guilty. So this is an act of mercy by Joseph, as far as the brothers and the steward seem to be concerned.
So each of the brothers hastened to lower his bag to the ground, and each one opened his bag. The steward searched, beginning with the oldest and ending with the youngest.
Which, remember, we knew that Joseph knew. That's how the steward knows who to search, because he seated the people earlier in age order, which was rather surprising to the brothers. But obviously he knew.
And the goblet turned up in Benjamin's bag.
Ta-da!
At this, they tore their clothes. Each reloaded his pack animal, and they returned to the city, all of them.
Yeah, exactly. Why? Why are they all going
they
back?
don't want to go home and tell their father they did it to a second son.
But
they got rid of Joseph. They had to confess to their father.
But the steward said the only person who's going to be, a slave is the guy whose bag was found in. Whose bag the goblet was found in. Ostensibly, it seems that they could have at least said, okay, so can the rest of us go? We don't get that dialogue, so we don't know whether they were or were not. We can interpret it all as much as we want, but at least possibly on the surface, they should be free to go. But instead, they are all going back with Benjamin, which, given whom they're going to be talking with, that crazy vizier guy, that takes some guts, because, he may behave very differently.
But it seems as though they have learned the lesson. What they did to Joseph was to send him off there on their own and go back and tell their father
for their own benefit, right?
For their own benefit, who was devastated. I am very impressed that they have now learned and are willing to sacrifice themselves not to do it a second time.
And that is the astonishing thing about the brothers. They have changed.
They have changed.
How beautiful it is when brothers dwell together in unity. It's like the oil.
Hinemato, exactly.
Well, they're guilty. I mean, they have a lot of guilt because what they did to Joseph and the pain they caused their father. And they really don't know what happened to Joseph. They sold him into slavery. They don't know if he's living.
Well, that's why they can't do that to Benjamin.
So,
they can't have two brothers disappear.
So
that's right.
they're guilty.
But Judah also pledged.
But they're not guilty of
Not
this.
this. Not of this.
Judah pledged to bring Benjamin back.
Yes, he did.
Yeah.
Yes, he
That's
did.
right. He pledged to bring him back.
Right. Remember, Reuben tried to pledge to bring him back
But he pledged
on
his own
penalty of his own kids being murdered, which Jacob said no. But Judah just said, I promise I will protect him and bring him back.
That's right.
Is this part of the test
I mean, is this part of Joseph's test? Oh, absolutely.
to see whether or not they've elevated themselves to a
This-
level where they're going to look out for each other and not every
He's
man for
giving
himself?
them the perfect opportunity.
Yes.
I mean, for all they know, Benjamin was guilty. Maybe the little spoiled brat did sneak off and steal the silver cup, right? They don't know. But on the other hand, fishy things have been happening here. So they could use this out and just go back to their dad and say, you know what, Benjamin stole from this guy, and we couldn't do anything about it. He was guilty, caught red-handed. But they don't. They instead are going back, and now we get the scene of reunification.
When Judah and his brothers re-entered the house of Joseph, who was still there, they threw themselves on the ground before him. Joseph said to them, "What is this deed that you have done? Do you not know that a man like me practices divination?" Judah replied, "What can we say to my Lord? How can we plead? How can we prove our innocence? God has uncovered the crime of your servants. Here we are then, slaves of my Lord, the rest of us, as much as he in whose possession the goblet was found."
All right, so what's Judah's position?
We can keep all of us.
Yeah.
Wow.
We're not going back without him,
Going back with it.
right? If he's a slave, we're all a slave. But are they guilty?
Not of this.
Not of this.
No, but they are guilty of, should I say, sibling rivalry.
But isn't he confessing to this crime, right?
But you don't necessarily get punished for a crime you didn't commit.
So, I mean, it's,
Well, the only thing I could think of, that Josephus did this so that they could think about what they did.
like I said, this is a very well-crafted test for them, and an opportunity for them to think about what they did, as a parent might say to a child.
Why does it say Yehuda and his brothers came into Joseph's house? In verse 14, it's not the brothers coming.
Oh, well, that's
Suddenly we have a new leader in the narrative.
right. Well, that's because Judah is taking his place as the leader of the brothers, right? And that
this
he
is where he
has
steps forward.
he has leapfrogged over Reuben, he who twice has ruined his reputation. He's leapfrogged over Levi and Shimon, who also had difficulty establishing themselves as level-headed leaders. And now, as the fourth oldest, he has risen to be the one who will be the leader. And that is one of the reasons why Judah as a tribe becomes the leader of tribes going forward. And eventually the king is chosen from the tribe of Judah and onward and onward. And why we, by the way, are also called Jews, which comes from the word Judah. That's where the term Jew comes from.
And it's also interesting when he said, when he says divination, you know, I'm a master, he's sort of referring to the fact that he can interpret the dreams, but they don't know what he means.
No.
And then Joseph ends up by saying, Joseph replies, "Far be it from me to act thus to keep you, all of you. Only he who is in possession of the goblet, where the goblet was found, shall be my slave. The rest of you, go back in peace to your father."
All right, now.
But how would these brothers even realize what Joseph is doing?
Well, they wouldn't.
They have no idea.
Because a real test isn't a test if you know it's a test.
Oh, right. They don't.
Right. I mean, if they know that this is a
They
test,
have no idea that Joseph is their brother.
it's like a fire drill. If you know there's going to be a fire drill at 10 o'clock, you behave differently during a fire drill than if you're woken up at 3 a.m. with the alarm screaming. And this is 3 a.m. wake up call alarm. And what do you really do when you're in that situation and you don't know that it's just a test, right? You don't know that this guy isn't going to really take Benjamin and turn him into a slave. Notice, by the way, the beautiful little dig that Joseph puts in at the end. Go back and peace to your father, right? Which is, and you get to go home and take the news that you've lost another one, right? Which is, bam. I mean, it's really forcing them to play. Now, next week we'll find that Judah does step up and argues more strongly than he's done so far in this Torah portion. And we do need, however, talk about why he's arguing at all, and what on what grounds is he arguing, and what do you do when the person in charge is behaving irrationally? Because I think that there is some underlying belief among the brothers that this is all a setup, that this was all choreographed, and this was probably choreographed by that guy, which means essentially he's trying to steal Benjamin as a slave. Right? Literally steal Benjamin as a slave.
So they're trying to figure out his motivation.
No, they're trying to figure out how to survive. Right. How do you handle a leader that's insane, right? From their point of view.
And get their brother back.
And get their brother back, exactly. What kind of appeals can you make? What kind of argument can you do? This isn't like where they have a jury sitting there that they can go talk to. This isn't where they have an appellate court that they can reach up to, right? What, are they going to go argue to Pharaoh?
No.
Yeah. We Hebrews came down here to buy some stuff, and this guy's been really mean to us. And Pharaoh's going to say, what? We wouldn't even get to talk to Pharaoh. So it's a moot point. All right. So our commentators, of course, also keyed in on the oddity of what the brothers are trying to do, especially Judah, really as the leader, in confronting, cajoling, appealing. How do they handle this? And how do they end up saying what he says in a way that makes sense to them? All right, so we're on the Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak side.
Yeah, Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak said, there is another abbreviation in the Bible. The sentence, and Judah said, what can we say to my master? What can we speak? And how can we justify? Needs tadak, justify.
Right, which is the end of the first line in Hebrew on page 270.
That stands for.
Right, so each letter of that is an acronym, right? The nun, the tzadi, the tet, the dalet, right? This is an acronym.
The nun is we are honest. The tzadik, we are righteous. The tav, we are pure. The dalet, we are innocent. And the kids, we are holy.
Right? So when he says, that how can we justify, right? How can we justify, how can we be vindicated is what he's trying to say. How can we explain in a way that will be considered tzedek, that will be considered justice, because that's the root word that's coming in this word. What he's hinting at, says the Talmud, is actually that we are all great guys. Right? So even at the moment when he is saying, there's nothing we can say before you, right? There's no possible justification we can give. According to the Talmud, he is in fact hinting that there are many justifications that he can give, which is this is not who we are, right? We are honest, we are pure, we are righteous, we are innocent, and we are holy. So therefore, don't think that we did this, but I can't say these things explicitly. Right? To say these things explicitly to somebody who holds this kind of dictatorial power is to put us into an adversarial position. And as soon as I become your adversary, I lose under a situation like this because you're a dictator. You're the one with all the spears, and I'm not. So if you get angry at me for arguing overtly with you, then it doesn't matter how good my arguments are, you'll have me killed. So the Talmud is seeing this as being, yes, he is saying, what can we say? Well, I could say that we're honest. How can we explain ourselves? Well, we are righteous and pure. And it's almost like this subtext of what he's saying. He's not giving up without a fight, but he's fighting in a different way. Because the situation is not a fight among equals.
And in reality, they are not honest and righteous because of what they did to their brother years ago. Maybe of this fraud, this setup, they're on. They had
maybe they've learned.
But
in the
I
intervening,
don't really
right. In the intervening years, they have learned, and they now are more righteous and honest because they're not going to leave their brother. They have learned.
Have they changed? Have they
That's the question. That's the key
Have they
question.
repented?
Well, but also, if they, let's imagine for example, that they have not repented. That they still believe that Joseph was a danger to them all. They still believe Joseph was going to become a tyrant over them, which was kind of how they interpreted his dreams. And getting rid of him was absolutely the best thing that could happen for the family, which, by the way, actually turns out to be true, because without Joseph in Egypt, they would have all starved to death. But that's a whole nother question of the meta idea of history. Let's imagine they're completely unrepentant. Does that mean that Benjamin should still have to become this guy's slave?
No.
Right? So their repentance doesn't affect the justice of the situation. It is still unjust what is happening to Benjamin from any independent third-party neutral observer's point of view. But there is no such thing as an independent neutral third-party observer point of view in this story in particular, because we're not dealing with some sort of institution of government that has as a goal a value of justice, of fairness, of equality of all litigants. That just doesn't exist here, right? This is number 2 in one of the most, dictatorial, authoritarian regimes in the history of the world. You don't get to say you're not fair, right? And that's hard for us. Remember, we come from the line of Abraham, who was willing to say to God, that doesn't sound fair. But you don't say that to the vizier of Egypt. So instead, you have to learn a different way to speak in order to plead your case without antagonizing him. And that's the thread they're trying, the needle they're trying to thread. But there's more to their feelings on this than just how can we plead without getting in trouble.
Why did Judah use the word gam also twice in verse 14? This was to teach us that also those of us against whom there is no evidence or suspicion at all are prepared to remain as your master's slaves, not to mention our brother in whose bag the goblet has been found.
Right? So they're trying to say also and also, meaning slavery for everyone, both the person who had the goblet as well as for the rest of us. Now, why is that important? Carry on.
The difference between what Judah says now and what he had said back in verse 9 is that in that verse, he had accepted the death penalty for the person in whose bag the goblet would be found, as he had been so sure that none of their bags would contain it.
Right? So he's in verse 14, he's actually changing the deal that he had made, right? Remember back in verse 9, he was all, let the one with whom it is found be killed. And now he's like, yes, yes, we should all be slaves. Slavery sounds good because that's a lot better than someone being killed.
When the brothers saw that it had been found in Benjamin's bag,
Sorry for the misspelling.
they offered themselves as slaves also, but backtracked on acknowledging that Benjamin would be sentenced to death. They hoped that their offer would save Benjamin from being convicted with the death penalty.
All right. So even though the steward had said, no, only the person with whom it is found will become a slave, they're now worried as they stand before this vizier that he may decide to execute Benjamin. And so the reason that they are saying all of us should become slaves, which doesn't get Benjamin out of Egypt, which was their initial goal, is to at least keep Benjamin from being killed.
Right.
So in case you're wondering, why did they go all in on the whole make us all your slaves thing, since that doesn't save Benjamin? According to Chizkuni, what he's trying to do, or what Judah's trying to do, is save Benjamin from being killed, even if that means he ends up being a slave. Right? Again, with the subtle use of his language and the way he's trying to lay an argument before the vizier without getting into an argument, he's trying to say, yeah, make us all your slaves, including the guy who did it. And all of us will be your slaves and not dead. It's this layer of a subtext to try and tilt the situation to a better outcome, even though it's still rotten.
But it's also very interesting because the brothers, Joseph and Benjamin, were their father's favorites.
Mm-hmm.
And they hated Joseph enough. They were originally going to kill him.
Yep.
It's only Reuben who said, sell him.
Let's profit off of it. No, Reuben actually just said, leave him in the pit. It was Judah who said, let's sell him.
Right? And so this is a complete change because Benjamin is clearly their father's favorite.
Mm-hmm.
He would have sacrificed any of the rest of them. He didn't say bring back any of the
He was
others.
prepared to sacrifice Simeon.
Simeon, yeah.
Yep.
And yet, even though they're still not their father's favorite, he still loves Benjamin more than them. Now they have changed so that they're willing to do this, leave themselves in slavery to save the boy.
Yep.
To save the father's
There
favorite.
is
What a
definite
change.
growth in their character.
Oh,
Yes.
tremendous.
How old is Benjamin? Why do we never hear Benjamin's voice?
What would you like to hear from
He's
him?
the baby.
Yeah. I mean, why?
Yeah, but I mean, he's not a baby. He must be at least a teenager.
At the very least. I mean, yeah. I mean, it's probably considerably older than that.
Yes.
You don't hear a voice saying, "I didn't do anything."
Because that voice doesn't matter,
Right.
which is the perfect segue to the next commentary.
The brothers shifted gears by no longer speaking about the person in whose pouch the goblet was found as being guilty for death, but we too, that is, Benjamin, was to be subject to the same penalty that they had declared themselves as guilty of, back in verse 9, of slavery.
Right,
The
so-
same penalty for slavery.
So Or HaChaim is following Chizkuni's lead of saying that they're shifting tactics here, and they're no longer arguing about the guilt per se. They're arguing about what punishment is appropriate. So having Benjamin say, I didn't do it, isn't enough, right? Because that's not going to fly in this courtroom, because this ain't a courtroom. So instead, they're switching, and they're going to make a little bit of an appeal to why this should be a mitigated sentence.
But even if it would fly, the goblet was found in his bag. I wasn't me, I didn't do it. It's your bag.
However, and this is why Jews are good lawyers, they make the argument.
They make the argument. They justify this by citing the fact there were no witnesses to the actual theft. Benjamin was able to plead that he did not know who placed the goblet in his pouch.
Right. So he can't say, I didn't take it because it was in the bag.
Right.
But what he can say is, I didn't put it there. Right? I may have carried it unknowingly, but I didn't put it there.
I may be in possession of stolen property, but that doesn't mean I
stole it.
lifted it.
Right. And it doesn't make me a thief. Right. And by the way, this is, part of American law. Right. If a cop pulls you over and he finds the Mona Lisa in your trunk,
Yes.
right, he absolutely is going to run you in as a potential thief and as in possession of stolen property, but they can't convict you for the theft unless they have something that can prove that you actually took it. Right. So that is an important distinction. And that seems to be the distinction, at least the commentators are pointing out, that they're pinning their hopes on Benjamin's life.
Well, one of the problems with this also is if you investigate it further, you may find that one of the other brothers put the goblet in his cup, and that would make it worse for everybody, right? Because you're certainly not going to blame the Grand Vizier for doing that.
Well, and so here's the problem is by saying, I don't know how it got there. The unspoken side of that is someone in your household, possibly on your instructions, Mr. Yankar Chain, did this. But they're not able to say that under these circumstances, right? That's just not what's in this system of a courtroom.
They don't know if they do this.
Well, no, well, they do know that he's
They do know.
unstable
They-
and irrational
Powerful
and
man, they
unpredictable.
don't-
Well,
they
they're
don't-
trying to reason with him because
Yeah.
I think deep down in each and every one of them, they knew that none of them stole that goblet, even though it was found in
Yeah,
Benjamin's. They
I
knew
agree.
that, but they knew that they themselves weren't thieves.
Well, they
Because the
also
same
knew they
thing
hadn't
happened.
taken the money that was in
Right,
there.
exactly, because the same thing had happened with the silver the previous trip and on this trip as well. They knew something's fishy going on when the bags are getting packed.
But remember what the steward says before when the silver is found, he says, do not be afraid, your God, the God of your father placed a treasure in your path.
Yeah,
Yeah, right, exactly.
which is a lovely way of saying, we didn't do it, so that you don't think there's something fishy going on in the vizier's house.
But I think their attitude is really commendable at this
Yes.
point.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Judah and the brothers
yeah.
falling in line behind him
Yeah.
are doing the best they can in this
Right,
circumstance,
exactly.
which is very impressive.
Yes.
All right, onward, because we got a lot more to go through.
We're up to Rashi.
We're up to Rashi.
We know that we have done no wrong, but it has been brought about by the Holy One, blessed be He, that this should come upon us.
All right, so Rashi begins to introduce this notion that's been floated around the table a few times. So Yashar Koach, for you guys thinking that they're saying, yeah, we didn't do this, but we have done stuff that's worthy of punishment, right? So yeah, none of us really believe that Benjamin took this. None of us believe that anyone took the silver back or anything like that. But we do know that we sold a brother into slavery. And what's happening now seems to be our comeuppance, right? This seems to be the wheel of karma coming round, and we're in trouble now because they couldn't think of Egypt in a neutral way, right? Egypt was where they sold him towards. So yeah, they are associating for themselves the problems they're having in Egypt with what they did to Joseph and his ultimate destination of Egypt.
And I think also, I mean, it wasn't just the fact that they could have come back and said, oh, he never showed up, like he disappeared, but they brought that coat all ripped up and bloodied and everything, and they watched their father just dissolve in front of their face.
Well, his
I
father
mean,
never would have given up looking for him.
But the father, they never said that he was killed. The father made that assumption. but
Right.
They didn't correct him. They said, no, he wasn't killed, we sold him. You know?
Yeah, oh, that was-
Joseph jumped to that conclusion.
But I mean, I think that they had really deep guilt over that.
Absolutely.
I mean,
And
because
that-
they saw
And the commentators
reaction
are picking up on that, right? And by the way, that whole reaction that was done to Jacob is then replayed for one of the brothers in the story of Judah and Tamar, right? The exact same
Exactly.
language of Haker na, can you recognize this, right? Is exactly the language that Tamar uses to confront Judah, is the same language that Judah used to confront their father when they presented the bloody coat. So
Oh,
Judah has now felt it, and also has felt the loss of a child, well, two children, who died before him. Remember, Judah lost two of his sons.
Yeah.
That's how he got into the whole situation with Tamar. So that's one reason why he is probably the leader in this, and why he is so sympathetic, both to the plight of Benjamin, but also to their father, because he now understands what it is to be a father. He understands what it is to lose someone. He understands what it is to be confronted of a crime. He gets it. He's developed empathy that he did not have before, and now he is putting that empathy to good use. But he's still doing it in a very uneven playing field. But let's talk more about their reflections on their guilt.
so this would be the brothers of
Yes.
Flesh. What can we say for the first money?
Right, the first money that was in the sacks.
What can we speak of the second money?
Now, why is the Midrash doing this? Because if you look at verse, what is this, 15, right? Verse 16, sorry, where it says Judah replies, right? We get three verbs for argumentation, right? What can we say? What can we speak? What can we justify? Or however they're trying to prove our innocence, right? He's using these three Hebrew verbs to come up with different scenarios. So what can we say about the first money, right? What could we speak? That's the second verb of that verse. about the second money, because remember there was money in those sacks too, not just the goblet. And then how can we justify for the cup, right? What can we justify for the cup? Right. Now I tried to preserve the Hebrew of the Midrash. That's why the English sounds really, really clunky. It works much better in the Hebrew, trust me.
And what can we say for Tamar? What can we speak for Bilhah? What can we justify for Dinah?
So what have they done here? Right? So they listed 3 crimes that aren't really their crimes. But now they're thinking about other things that have happened and that are their crimes, right? What about Bilhah, right? When Reuben moved the couch, right? What about Dinah, right? What about Tamar? We've done wrong things and we've allowed wrong things to happen, right? So they can't explain the money because they're innocent, but they also can't explain these things because they were wrong deeds. And this is transforming from being an argumentation of their innocence into a confession of their actual guilt. Right? We can't explain how the money stuff happened because we didn't do it, but we also can't explain how Tamar happened because there was no justification for what I did there. Right? And that's actually the term that's used. The same term tzedek is used with regards to Tamar about she is more correct, she is more justified than I when Judah is being confronted by her. Onward.
What can we say to Abba, our father, in the land of Canaan about Joseph? What can we speak of Simeon? How can we justify Benjamin? If we say we have sinned, it is obvious and known that we did not.
Right, meaning the sin of the cup and the money, right?
If we say that we didn't sin, God has uncovered the sin of your servants, Rabbi Yitzhak said. The owner of the debt found the place to collect his note.
Right, so there's been a bill that's been hanging over them, a debt for their crime against Joseph that's been hanging over them. And now, here's an opportunity for God to collect. Right? You talked about their feelings of guilt for all these years. Right? They've been feeling guilty, and now when this axe comes down, they're like, finally we're being punished for what we did. And it's almost a sense of relief, but it's also a sense of despair. Right? And they can't confess, and they also can't deny. They can't confess to the crime that they're being accused of, but they can't deny that they're still worthy of the punishment that is being put down on them, because after all, what was it they did to their brother? They sold him to be a slave. What is the punishment they are about to receive? They are about to become slaves, right? Same for same. Measure for measure, which is our next line. Yes.
All of this was measure for measure. Because of their sitting to eat bread when Joseph was in the pit, it was decreed upon them also to sit and eat bread under terrifying circumstances.
Which they did in the previous chapters, right? When Joseph is got them all there, and they're like, this guy's weird, what's going on?
We're eating the food.
Yeah.
Until Joseph himself said, what shall we speak? Until Judah himself said, what shall we speak, and how shall we justify ourselves? God has found out the sin of your servants. Behold, we are slaves to my Lord. And with this, he admits the essential judgment for the selling.
All right, so the ultimate proof, right, that comes here is what's the word that he uses for the confession of their sin? God has found out. He's not saying you have found out. He's saying God found out our sin. He's not confessing when he says God found out our sin to the cup and the coins. He's confessing to Joseph, right? To the sale of his brother. And he's basically saying, you know what? It's fair. We sold him, and we've lived with that for these years. It's fair. We deserve to be slaves. You're right. God has finally brought it due, and we're prepared to pay. We're prepared to pay the price. Right? Not death, but definitely the price for this. It's heartbreaking, but he's saying God has been apparently just biding his time. It's not as though God had ignored the crime that they had committed. It was just God was waiting for the moment to collect the bill, and this is it. There are some other children that I want to bring to your attention in our continued quest to touch on more parts of the Tanakh. And these are some other sons that don't learn from their mistakes, don't feel remorse, and cause a lot of problems. So we are now going to switch over to the book of Shmuel, the book of Samuel. And most of you probably are most familiar with the first chapter of the book of Samuel, because we read it on as a haftarah for Rosh Hashanah, the story of Hannah and the birth of Shmuel, of Samuel himself, for which the book is named. Well, at the time, there was a guy in charge of the Mishkan, the tabernacle, named Eli, right? Eli HaKohen. And he had 2 sons, and they were basically being groomed to take over after him. And they didn't behave the way you'd want Kohanim to behave.
Now, Eli's sons were scoundrels. They paid no heed to the Lord. This is how the priests used to deal with the people. When anyone brought a sacrifice, the priest's boy would come along with a 3-pronged fork while the meat was boiling, and he would thrust it into the cauldron or the kettle or the great pot or the small cooking pot. And whatever the fork brought up, the priest would take away on it.
All right, so it's kind of like a meaty lottery, right? You come up and there's a big stew pot or whatever, and you just say, all right, this is the priest's portion, and whatever you pull up is what you get. And if you pull up a huge piece, then that's, going to be what? If you pull up a small piece, that's what you get. And it's, proportional, because it's just boom, and you go, right? And that was considered fair-ish for what the priests were doing.
This was the practice at Shiloh with all the Israelites who came there. But now, even before the suet was turned into smoke, the priest's boy would come and say to the man who was sacrificing, hand over some meat to roast for the priest, because he won't accept boiled meat from you. He only wants raw.
Right. So rather than waiting until the sacrifice had even really been performed, remember when they would sacrifice an animal, the belly fat, which is what they're calling the suet here, would be burnt on the altar and make the smoke. That was sort of the main point of the sacrifice, along with the sprinkling of the blood. The rest of the animal was eaten by the person who brought it. This is for like the peace offerings and the wellness offerings. So you're supposed to wait until the sacrifice has been made, meaning until the fat's been on the fire and the blood's been sprinkled. And they're already calling dibs before that's even taken place, let alone waiting until the person who brought the sacrifice, the person who's celebrating, has prepared the celebration. They are wanting like money on the barrel, and this is a breach of what the priests are supposed to do. Right? This is a shakedown, essentially. And basically saying, if you don't sacrifice, well, what's going to happen? If you don't give us, what's going to happen?
And if the man said to him, let them first turn the suet into smoke and then take as much as you want, the priest's boy would reply, no, hand it over at once, or I'll take it by force. The sin of the young men against the Lord was very great, for the men treated the Lord's offerings impiously.
Right? So quite literally, they wanted their cut. And yes, they were owed a portion of what was being sacrificed for the priests themselves to eat, not just for the altar. But they are treating this not as their sharing of the celebratory sacrifice. This is, I want to cash in, right? I want my cut. And if I don't get the cut I want, there's going to be violence, right? They're literally threatening violence in order to extort from the person who came to the tabernacle with a joy, right? Because this is not like for a sin offering. This is for a joyous offering. And they are threatening them with violence if the priests can't get the cut that they want before it's already even been part of the celebrant's sacrifice. Let me give you a modern equivalent of how
offensive. Push the line ahead of God.
It's worse than that, right? Let's imagine that I was officiating at a wedding, right? And I said, I'm not going to do the wedding until you load up 5 bottles of wine that you were going to use for the reception in the back of my car, right? And if you don't load up my car with that wine, I'm going to start getting ugly. I'm going to start punching. You want me to punch the bride? Right? You want her to go into the chuppah with a black eye? You put that wine in my trunk right now, or else you're not getting a wedding, and I'm going to start banging heads.
And I don't want this check. I want cash, and I want it now, or I'm not.
At our wedding, that's exactly what the rabbi did.
He stole wine?
No. What he said.
He punched the bride?
He came in,
I don't want
and then he saw it was a rather large wedding. He wasn't going to charge a lot, but when he saw that we had invited a lot of people, He said, excuse me, if you don't pay me right now, I'm leaving. I'm not doing the wedding. They paid him. Just what you said.
Bring me cash.
Give me cash right now. Yes.
Cash on the barrel. And my guess is that you did not feel that was a dignified way to behave.
When David told me about it later, it was
Yeah.
not, but I realized there was nothing else he could do. We're all there gathered, the chuppah is up, I'm waiting, what would you do?
Well, no, there's nothing else for him to do.
No.
But I'm talking about for the rabbi, what could he have done?
Yes, that was
Plenty of
awful.
other things to do.
Oh, yeah.
He was, yes, it was awful.
By the way, on a side note, I was given a very good piece of advice that if anyone ever complains about the standard honorarium, which, by the way, if someone's a member of TI, there is no honorarium expected for a wedding. That's just part of being a member. But when I used to do weddings for the general population up in Baltimore, the rabbi that I was trained with said, all you have to do is say, look, if you think that what I'm asking is too much for officiating the ceremony, just give me what you're paying for the flowers. Just give me the same amount that you're giving to the florist,
Which is more.
which is a lot more. Right? It could be worse. You could say, give me as much as you're paying the DJ, or give me as much as you're paying the photographer, right? But the florist is like at the bottom of the hierarchy, and it is still higher than the clergy. So yeah, you always want to make sure those things are dealt with in advance. Because if you don't,
it also is, how much did the rabbi charge? Oh, the same as the florist. And everyone goes, oh, that was nice. You don't come across as greedy,
Well, he was actually saying, don't
no,
actually
that's
charge what the
florist.
florist charge. Tell them if they don't like what you've said you should pay, you then say, well, tell you what, I'll take whatever the florist is taking,
Right.
as though you're acting as though you think that might be
Yeah.
less, which is a way of giving them a chance to reflect that maybe what you've asked for the person who's actually doing the ceremony is not unreasonable. But it all has to be done in advance. It all has to be done in a dignified and proper way. And that is not what Eli's sons were doing, right? They had the right to part of the sacrifices. That is true. But they were misusing their ability to weigh in with force and to withhold the ability to have people have a proper sacrifice and the proper celebration that they were looking for in order to extort more than was their due, and in a way that brought disgrace upon God and upon the sacrifices and the services of Shiloh and all of this. And that is causing a huge problem in the community. Okay?
Maybe
So,
that's why God felt we were ready to have the temple destroyed and not do this anymore.
well, this is before the temple.
This is
Oh,
before.
This is when we still have the Mishkan. the
That's
tent.
right, this is still in the tent.
Right.
Still in the
Okay.
tent.
Instead, this is going to become one of the reasons why we end up with a king.
Now, Eli was very old. When he heard all that his sons were doing to all Israel and how they lay with the women who performed tasks at the entrance of the tent of meeting.
So apparently it wasn't just the meat in the pot that they were
No.
stirring, right? These guys were all over.
Oh my gosh. He said to them, why do you do such things? I get evil reports about you from the people on all hands.
By the way, do we remember evil reports being mentioned before?
No, I don't.
The beginning of the Joseph story, right? Joseph would bring evil reports about his brothers.
About
That
his
was
brothers.
one of the reasons they hated him,
That's weird.
right? And
Yeah.
and what was their response?
Just get rid of them.
Let's get rid of him, right? And Eli's sons, unfortunately, they are like the younger brother versions, which is to say they're not going to be saying, oh, we hadn't realized this was a problem. Thank you for bringing it to our attention. We will remedy the situation. They're not going to hear the evil reports. They're going to say it's bad that people are tattling on us, rather than saying they have a point.
And so Eli said to them, don't, my sons. It is no favorable report I hear the people of the Lord spreading about. If a man sins against a man, the Lord may pardon him. But if a man offends against God, who can obtain pardon for him? But they ignored their father's plea, for the Lord was resolved that they should die.
Right? So this was the end of this idea of having the Kohanim have some level of political and community leadership, rather than just being confined to the more, in quote, ceremonial functions that they perform. Because the hereditary of the Kohanim was becoming problematic in their abuse of their station, the corruption of where they were and the power that they wielded. And that's very much the same problem that was being faced in the court of the vizier, where again he was, for all of the brothers' perception, he was corrupted and misusing his position. But there they had no recourse. Here we do, right? Because these are our Kohanim. This is our nation. And God did tell us that we were all Kohanim in the eyes of God, that we were all priests in God's eyes, and that we all have certain rights, and that we are allowed to remedy these situations. So that is one of the benefits of having been in a mostly egalitarian type of faith and culture. That was the basic Israelite template. Wasn't always a perfect egalitarian model, that's a whole other conversation, but it was a lot more equal and a lot better for opportunity for redress than the Egyptian model that the other brothers were dealing with. So just a couple commentary and then we'll move on.
The custom of the Kohanim, they established this law for themselves since they rightfully inherited only the breast and the thigh of the peace offering.
All right, so the whole putting the fork in and pulling out what you get, right? Jack Warner put his thumb stuck, pull out a plum, right? That is kind of already a beginning of deteriorating what the actual law is, right? If you actually go back and you read through the Torah, they don't really get to just pick whatever they want. They are supposed to only be getting the breast and thigh piece as part of their portion. So they've already begun, even before Eli's sons were getting so bad, to move the system more in their favor because they could, to exploit their status and position. But his sons went even further, right? And that's often what happens, right? The first person who corrupts a system usually just takes a small bribe, right? And it's not really a bribe, it was a gift, right? The businessman needed help getting the permit through, and it was a perfectly legitimate permit. And normally I only get paid by the city, but lo and behold, I also got a car, right? And you know, that it wasn't a bribe, it was just his way of thanking me for what I had done. And would I have done the same thing without the car? Oh yes, of course, probably. But after a while, the car for getting the permit becomes expected. And then if you're not getting the car for the permit, you're showing up with the fist, or you're letting the sheriffs harass them, or something. Once that first line of corruption gets passed, then you're on your way to Egyptville, which is where Eli's sons were headed, which is creating a fully corrupt society. And that was something that God and our ancestors couldn't tolerate, which is why we're going to end up with Shmuel coming out as a prophet. And indeed, why we end up with these prophetic voices throughout the book of Nevi'im, right? Throughout the book of the prophets, who are going to have a role not as civic leader, not as someone who can be corrupted because they have temporal authority, but as a voice of truth and justice to speak against those who are abusing their station. And that's why we call this the book of the prophets, even though it's mostly dealing with like the history and the kings and all that. They aren't the main characters. The main characters are the people who stand up to the people in power who are misusing their station.
Because you have to formally have a way to, you shall reprove your neighbor, or you will incur guilt yourself.
Even if it's the king.
You have to create a space for that to happen.
Right.
Otherwise, you don't have the right balance.
Exactly. Because what these people were doing was wrong, right? This whole threat of violence was wrong, unless you think, well, you know, threat of violence, is it really that bad? Onward through the Talmud.
Ze'ira says, that Rabbi Hanina says, one who raises his hand to strike another is called a sinner.
Right, that means even without hitting.
Oh, just
Right?
raise your
Even
hand.
without hitting, right? If you go, you have already committed a transgression, right? You don't have to make contact before you have sinned. Yes, making contact is a worst transgression, but threatening violence is also a transgression.
It's called sinner because the way it says it. And the priest's lad would come and would say to him, but you shall give now, and if not, I will take by force. And it is written with regard to this behavior, and the sin of the youth was very great.
It doesn't say that they actually beat the people up to take the meat, but nevertheless, the next verse says that they had sinned and that their sin was a great one. So therefore, threat of violence to get what you want is already a transgression, right? And that's part of how we kill the baby steps towards full corruption, is by saying not even the whiff of a threat of reprisal is allowed in these types of circumstances. And that needs to always be our standard in our Jewish ways, because it's always too easy for people who have any position of authority and power to convince themselves that a little extra is their just the desserts. And once it becomes an unequal playing field, we're back in the courtroom of Joseph, there's very little that can be done to fix the situation short of revolution. Yes.
How come you need the kings and or ultimately the prophets to rebuke these people? How come there were no courts to do so?
Well, the courts were mostly being run by the Kohanim themselves, as well as the educated sages of the time and the elders. But most of them did not have the authority to impose punishments and penalties upon these folk. They didn't.
Could not impose punishment on
The court didn't have the executive authority to implement their will if it wasn't wished by those who also had authority. The Kohanim had their own thugs.
Yeah.
They had their own heavies.
We didn't have our own country then that we were in charge of.
Well, we had our confederacy,
Yeah,
but it meant that there was no one above the Kohanim who had an equal violent group that could compel them to obey without getting into full-on civil war. There wasn't like the Kohanim admitted that the courts had legitimacy in overruling them on these types of cases.
Because you already had the courts of the 71 plus the lower courts at this time, right?
But that doesn't work if they don't recognize your authority.
How can you enforce a judgment?
Right, so they just didn't have an executive branch to enforce it.
That's why we needed.
They didn't have a permanent standing executive branch, which is what's going to lead to the formation of a kingdom, of the sovereignty of, first Saul and then David, which brings with it all of its own problems.
Yes.
But it is a step in the right direction to begin to recognize that we need not only legislature and not only the judiciary, but we also need some sort of executive in order to make sure that it works. And we all need to see the functioning of all three pieces together as some balanced form of society, or else it's every man for himself.
And it's also the separation of church and state. That
Yes,
religions don't leave it. It's two
Although
different
if we
things.
wanted to be at this time of year with the Maccabees on our mind, if we wanted to talk about what happens when you don't do that,
Don't do that.
we can look at the Hashmonean dynasty that comes out of the Maccabees, where they take both the crown as well as the Choshen
That's
Mishpat,
right.
the breastplate,
Not
and it's not a good
Doesn't
result.
work
And
out well.
yeah, it does not go well.
Doesn't work.
With that in mind, however, Hanukkah Sameach, and
good. Yeah. That's right. Okay.